to Housing. With me are Lindsay Judge from the Resolution Foundation and Matthew Lesh from the Adam Smith Institute. You saw laid out there a simple problem: young people, local people, not able to afford houses, and really the sort of houses that are being built are not answering their needs. What do you think of that?
Well, I think in the first sense we have to acknowledge there's a bit of a contradiction here. On the one hand, we have this kind of strong objection to a lot of house building in rural towns and some rural towns at least and some rural villages, and then we also have this issue about affordability. Unfortunately, we really do need to start with the premise that we have to be able to build more homes. If we can't build more homes, we can't solve the housing crisis.
But if they're shown to yuppies as second homes, it doesn't really help anybody, does it?
Well, I mean, the housing market works across the board. If you have more homes at the mid-level, then that's going to free up more homes for people that are more affordable. It's going to pull down the price of housing overall when you build more homes.
I think Matthew's right. We do need to build more homes. That's definitely part of the solution to the housing crisis. But the housing crisis is very complex. It's a question of costs. It's a question of security. It's a question of home ownership. It's a question of homelessness. So as with any complex problem, there isn't, unfortunately, a simple solution to that. When you look at building more homes, I mean, it's critical that they're built in the right places. That means they need to be built in places where there are jobs or there are good transport links. And it obviously links very much to the question of rural housing. But the other critical question is they've got to be built at the right price point. And your piece showed very clearly that we haven't invested in social housing in this country for many, many years, and now we're paying the price. There needs to be a lot more focus on that type of building.
Could you, in that area in Cirencester, I mean, if you built a great deal of social housing, would there be people, you know, who would fill those houses? Because in some areas there's been depopulation for years because that's not where the work is.
Well, that's absolutely true, and that definitely means that local authorities need to take a good, long, strategic look at exactly where houses are built. But you could see the figures in your piece on the waiting list. There are just huge numbers of people in need, huge numbers of people who are paying an unacceptable amount of their income in the private rented sector.
What do you see as the role of social housing? Because, you know, at the Conservative conference, the proposal was to start selling off some social housing, which would actually presumably diminish the stock for people who couldn't afford to buy.
Well, I mean, the UK has some of the highest proportion of social housing in Europe. I believe it's about the second highest. I think social housing is necessary for people who are truly in need and don't have other housing, particularly people who are homeless. But I think we have to have a broader discussion about building more housing both at a rural and an urban level. I think, for example, a key reason why we're seeing this housing issues in rural area is because of the housing issues in urban areas. We're seeing people having to commute long distance from rural areas, rural towns and rural villages, who are earning high incomes in cities and then pushing up the costs of housing in these rural areas because they can't live close to the high-paying jobs. So if we can build more houses in urban areas, we're going to have less of an issue in rural areas. So all these issues, I think, are very interrelated when it comes to housing problems.
Is that right? We have a very high level of social housing in this country?
We have a high number of social housing, but as a proportion of our housing stock, it's not particularly high across Europe. I think the big issue with housing policy is that it's a long game. So you can make an announcement today, you don't see the homes built for several years, you don't see the effects of those homes on the price for many, many years to come. And of course, that doesn't really fit with our 5-year or even shorter electoral timetable. I think that does point particularly to the need to sort of cross-party consensus on where we're going on housing policy. And I think the flip side of underbuilding on social housing is that we have to have a better offer for private renters these days. We know, for example, there are 1.6 million families with children, bringing them up in private rented homes in England today. And you can imagine the difficulties if you can lose your home at 2 months' notice and you have a child in school.
So what would be your policy prescription? I mean, what do you think needs to be done, you know, within the bounds of the art of the possible, as people sometimes call politics?
Well, actually, the government at the moment is consulting on giving greater security of tenure to tenants in England. That's actually something they've already done in Scotland, so we can look north of the border for an example of how that's unrolled. So they're definitely making strides in this respect. That would give people a lot more sense that their private rented property was their home. They could bed in, they could form local connections, and that would make, I think, a great deal of difference to people's lives.
They wouldn't build any more houses, though, would it?
I wouldn't build any more houses. I mean, in terms of building more homes, I think what we need to look at is the fact that The housing market is very exposed to the general economy. So if there's a whiff of a downturn, builders quite rightly pull in their horns and cut off their supply. I think we have to again look to the public sector. If the public sector is building at volumes, that keeps going during downturns, and that keeps the output quite high and means that the government may indeed hit its target of 300,000 homes a year.
What policy changes would you like to see?
Well, I think the real challenge is to find a way to ensure that building more homes and building particularly medium density housing developments around London and around Cambridge and around Oxford and right around the country becomes possible. I think there's some key reforms we can do. For example, I think councils should be able to approve development on the land that they own and then on-sell that so that they get some of the upshot for local investment and infrastructure. I think that streets should be able to come together and agree to increasing the number of stories and increasing development in their own street based upon a local plan. And I think we do have to have a serious debate about building on the Greenbelt, particularly near train stations. We can build 1 million new homes on just 3.7% of the Greenbelt within walking distance of train stations that would completely, this is just in London, of course, that would completely change the housing market for good when it comes to cost issues.